simply are not deliberative bodies at all. They've got their minds made up. They're really industry bodies, and they go through the motions. In the case of the National Energy Board, they don't even do that because they forbid cross-examination in a lot of cases, and they are absolutely phony.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Rafe Mair, former BC Cabinet Minister and Canada's #1 radio talk show host. Welcome to the show, Rafe.
Nice to be with you, Jim.
Some disappointing news, maybe it's a window into the future. Robin Allen, an economist, has dropped out of the National Energy Board's environmental review of the twinning of the pipeline to the Burnaby oil refinery. She says the committee is biased and that the fix is already in to approve the project.
This goes right along with Mark Eliason leaving the National Energy Board last November. You may remember he said about the same stuff, only probably even stronger than Robin, although Robin was pretty strong. And you've got people of this stature in our community are talking about these deliberative bodies in that way. And what it's saying, Jim, is that they simply are not deliberative bodies at all. They've got their minds made up. They're really industry bodies, and they go through the motions. In the case of the National Energy Board, they don't even do that because they forbid cross-examination in a lot of cases, and they are absolutely phony. Now, I can tell you something from my own personal experience. Back about 3 or 4 years ago, I was very much involved fighting the independent power projects, the IPPs we call them, which were ruining the rivers of British Columbia to provide power to BC Hydro. If I recall correctly, at about 4 times what it cost BC Hydro to buy it on the market, and about 5 times what it cost BC Hydro to make it. And Damien Gillis and I were partners in Common Sense Canadian, a magazine, or an online paper. We went to a great number of these things. And at the end of them, my comment for a reporter was, I would rather have a root canal without any anesthetic than ever go to one of those again. I mean, they're stacked right from the beginning. The chairman is already in cahoots with the industry. They're almost hand in hand on the stage. I'm talking about the environmental one. It's a little narrower than the one that Robin was on. But they would tell you that they couldn't hear anything on the question of whether or not the proposal was a good one. The only thing we poor unwashed were allowed to do was to make suggestions to the company as to how they might improve their environmental approach to it, and once you said, well, wait a minute, you're going to have to chop down trees, you'd be ruled out of order because that project had already been approved. You'd have to come up with something, some scientific thing, I guess. But in any event, I went through a great number of these things, and it was the most frustrating thing. You'd come up with your stomach churning. So I only say that, Jim, to say that, I can understand. I've got a huge amount of respect for Robin. She was head of ICBC, and she's a very well-known economist. And same with Mark Eliason, who was head of BC Hydro, head of Winnipeg Hydro, head of Ontario Hydro. These people, when they say these things are biased and they're phony and they're just industry shills, they know what they're talking about. What worries me is we don't seem to want to take notice.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago, Ottawa changed the rules on all this, that the federal cabinet can overrule any environmental hearing ruling. So I thought, why do they even bother holding the hearings if Ottawa, if Harper wants it, it's a done deal?
Well, that's a good question. Why bother? It's an insult to the intelligence. You have to go back to the very beginning. The National Energy Board used to be appointed by Parliament and had to report to Parliament. Well, that was changed. It was reported to the minister. Well, all of a sudden, the National Energy Board, by surprise, came out of the oil patch in Calgary, and those are the people sitting. And then every once in a while, they'd appoint somebody that looked a little more independent than that. But you can only say this so many times, Jim, and I don't want to be an alarmist. I just want to say, frankly and flat out, these organizations, the ones that I have mentioned, the one that Robin's involved in, Mark Elias, the National Energy Board, the environment assessment things that I went to, they are as phony as a $3 bill. I can tell you this, we have had people in Lions Bay, the Sea to Sky area, go to the assessments for the proposed LNG plant in the wood fiber one in Squamish, and they've come back, and these are ordinary, everyday, decent people. They've come back with their heads wheeling. This is impossible. You can't have that kind of crap in a democracy. Rafe was right. There's no point in going to them. Well, is it little wonder that we all are cynical about our governments and cynical about, as the Anglican Church said, people setting authority over us? Little wonder. I mean, it's just awful.
Well, I know when they had the public hearing part of the environmental assessment, the public was banned from the public hearings.
Well, some of them they were. It all depended. But I would guess that most of the people, 99% of the people that were at the meetings that I was at, were just livid by the time they were finished. Now, I want your listeners to understand, these people didn't go with baseball bats or anything to try and make any trouble. They had legitimate concerns about this particular project. And they'd want to know, well, what's going to happen to the level of the river? What's going to happen to the salmon that come up the river? What's going to happen to the insect life? What's going to happen to the bears and the birds, the eagles that rely upon these fish? What's going to happen to the ecology? What's going to happen when you put in transmission lines? What's going to happen when you put in roads? And those are the kind of questions they wanted to ask. Every one of those was out of order.
Well, and don't forget, too, Kinder Morgan was allowed to chop down trees in Burnaby's natural reserve because the federal board overrules local government.
Well, that's right. That's exactly what happened. And it's absolutely a travesty, Jim. I would think that any Canadian, even if they are anti-environmentalist and pro-pipelines and all the rest of it, would say, wait a minute, we don't do this in Canada. When we have hearings, we let people be heard. And when we have people hearing these things, we expect them to be independent and come up with an independent recommendation. I think that every Canadian would feel that way. Well, you don't want to go to one of these meetings if you feel that way, I can tell you.
Well, and when it comes to protection of the environment, don't forget in China, where they haven't worried about the environment until now, the average life expectancy there has dropped by 6 years because of their rampant air pollution. So if you don't think the the environment counts, it certainly does.
Oh, of course it does. And, this is one of the few sort of grass level places that the public can actually get at the promoter and at the government and ask some questions. And when they get there, they find that the whole thing's stacked. They might as well not have it.
And of course, a few months ago, Vancouver had a minor oil spill. The Coast Guard was overwhelmed by it. The Coast Guard failed to notify the city of Vancouver about it. And even now, if you go for a walk along the seawall, you'll still find oily sludge underneath these rocks. And this was a tiny spill, as oil spills go, and it overwhelmed the facilities here. What do you think would happen in Vancouver, Burrard Inlet, and along the entire Salish Sea if we had a major spill?
Well, I wrote a blog today, as it turned out, Jim, on the one in Santa Barbara. And as I forget what the loss is now, 121,000 liters. Oh, no, I honestly forget.
400,000 liters that they know about, and it keeps getting bigger as they discover more of this oil.
Exactly. Now, my theme in my blog was, well, of course, it can't happen here because this is Canada. This is British Columbia. Mr. Harper has forbidden it to happen here. Ms. Clark has forbidden it to happen here. And all of the experts here say, well, it can't happen at all. And if it did, we clean it up in 35 seconds. I mean, we just do not understand these things. Santa Barbara, I know a lot of people from British Columbia have been there. I mean, that's a glory spot. That's one of the most beautiful spots and beaches in the world. And that is just being ravaged. If that happened in Vancouver Harbor, I just shudder to think, Jim. It's just too appalling to even consider. But we run those risks. Now, here's I think the difficulty people have, Jim. Along comes an expert and says, well, it's such a remote risk, and you have to run risks. Well, you've got to think about that for a second. There is no such thing as a remote risk. A risk is an event waiting to happen. The only question is, when will it happen? Will it happen in the next 10 seconds, or will it happen in the next 1,000 years or 100 years? You don't know. What you do know is it's going to happen. Now, if it's going to happen to one ship, what are the odds going to be when there's 400 ships? Now, I'm sure that most of your people have shot craps of Vegas or played cards or whatever it is. And you know that the more times you do something, the more chances there are it's going to come up. Just flip a coin. You can flip a coin and detect it, one time, but if you flip it 400 times, you're bound to get a head or a tail in one of those 400. And this is what we have to start to think about. That this really is like flipping a coin. Sooner or later, it turns up heads.
We'll have more with Rafe Mair right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
In Goddard we trust.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Rafe Mair. Rafe, the U.S. Coast Guard for a number of years now has issued an annual report saying they're very concerned about BC and Canada's lack of facilities to respond to a major oil spill because simply they think it's going to drift into the waters around Seattle and Port Angeles.
Well, and now we have the opening up of the north in the Arctic, and those ships are all going to go right by the BC coast. Now, there's something very remarkable in all this, Jim. When the Quaddy, I think that's how they pronounce it, one was proposed in the United States, just near the Canadian border in the east, near New Brunswick, Prime Minister Harper set his hair on fire. Oh, jumped up and down. We will have no LNG tankers going up and down the coast of Canada, and it became a diplomatic incident. Our ambassador got into it in a big way, and it was a big deal. Now, is it easier to see the East Coast than it is the West Coast? I mean, what the hell's the difference? And yet, they're going to just go up and down and sail all over the place in the West Coast, and as far as the government of Canada is concerned, they don't care. Now, we've just had, as you pointed out, a minor spill in our harbor, and look at the problems that it caused. A minor one. Now, that's something that, it wasn't even really a spill in the sense of a collision or a pipeline bursting or anything like that. It was a spill, but it wasn't a huge one. What's going to happen when we have the big ones?
Right, and I was going to say, too, with the proposal in Burnaby, they'd put a number of giant tanks up on the mountainside. Burnaby Fire has already said, we don't have the facilities to fight a fire there, and you've seen how catastrophic one of those tanker farm fires can be.
Well, the whole thing with Kinder Morgan is a disgrace, and I don't know what's the matter not with us. I think that the good citizens of Burnaby, when they had their protest last year, I think they did an awful lot of good, and they opened an awful lot of eyes. We suddenly saw that these weren't wild-eyed, I shouldn't say bearded, since I have one myself, but, these weren't wild-eyed, I don't know what you want to call them, revolutionaries about to destroy things. These were husbands and wives and kids that lived in the community and said, look, we just don't want this. We want our park, thank you very much. We want to have our streets. We don't want to live with the threat that this poses, and it does. And I think that slowly but surely the public is turning. I live in a very small C conservative community of Lions Bay, and I can tell you the feeling against the proposed wood fiber LNG plant is enormous. I mean, it's unbelievable. People that have always been sort of business-oriented, etc., salt of the earth, Anglican Church, all that sort of stuff, are up in arms. So I think there are changes coming that industry and governments haven't really glommed onto yet.
Yeah, I remember the LNG thing in Squamish. Their environmental bow to the community was, well, instead of having gray, ugly tanks, we'll paint them green so they blend into the hillside.
Oh, yeah, well, that's, of course, a story all of itself, but I don't know whether we've talked about on previous programs, but those of us that are fighting, particularly our leader, Owen Finn, has established beyond any doubt that tankers are outside all of the standards that are set for tankers in a fjord. Even the industry organization SIGTO says no, you shouldn't do it, and all of the science in the States says no, you can't do it. And yet the premier of this province is sailing along as if there's nothing wrong, nothing even to answer for. She has never, ever dealt with that question, Jim. Now, just ponder that for a second. We've got the southernmost fjord in Canada, right? I'm sitting looking out at it right now. Is that narrow, too narrow for freighters carrying LNG? Well, you would think the premier would say, look, before we go any further, we're going to find out the answer to that, because that's a critical, that's sort of a conditioned precedent. You can't have an LNG plant out there if it's unsafe to take the tankers. Well, if you go to the tanker organization, huge organization, 50 some odd countries belong to it, or you talk to Dr. Michael Hightower down in the States, or a number of others that we have spoken to, and get their reports. If you take the reports and superimpose them on a chart of how sound, Jim, there is absolutely no way. The line of the unsafe line on the outside goes right up the Sea to Sky Highway and right over the top of Bowen Island. I mean, it's not even close. And yet our premier has never asked a question about it.
Well, I know the Kinder Morgan pipeline ads for the Northern Gateway project, they said, don't forget, these tankers will be tethered to a tugboat at all times. But here in Vancouver, we've already had an accident. The brand new causeway to the coal terminal in Delta Port was sliced in half by a bulk carrier that was attached to a tugboat.
Oh, it happens, Jim. You know, the one thing that you always have to remember is human failure. I was going to use a naughty word there, but everybody knows what I'm talking about, and it happens. If you and I had been sitting down having a beer 5 or 6 years ago, and I said, Jim, I bet you a BC ferry hits a rock and goes to the bottom and kills a couple of people, you'd have laughed at me. You'd said, too much to drink, let's go home. But that's what happened, and it happened because of human error. Now, I think there are more things than human error that you've got to worry about, but that is the one thing you simply cannot legislate against. You can't do anything to offset it or safeguard against it. It's always there, whether you're in Korea or whether you're on the coast of British Columbia, wherever you are. That is always a very, very serious problem.
And then, of course, you can take human error out and have mechanical problems like the ferry that crashed into the dock at Horseshoe Bay. A $1.15 cotter pin fell out and they couldn't go into reverse. So they ran over $1 million yachts and narrowly missed a number of people working on those boats.
Well, I want to, I'm running a little short of time, if I may say so, Jim, but I want to sort of talk about this very, very quickly. The LNG people at Squamish, the wood fiber people, they talk in this way. They say, look, we have gone something like 100 years with only very few LNG tankers ever get into trouble. I mean, they have an absolutely excellent safety record. I wouldn't argue with that. Of course they do. But they have it on the high seas. They don't have it in fjords because they don't go into fjords like Howe Sound. And yet our premier is just begging them to come in and run these freighters up and down Howe Sound. I mean, there is the key to it, and people should think about that. The safety record of LNG tankers, which I would not argue with, is based upon the fact that they stay the hell away from narrow inlets. And they do it deliberately. They know that there's a problem if they don't. So, you know, that's you're really getting to the bottom. We're not paying attention, Jim, to the very simple things. I mean, this isn't rocket science we're talking about here. The question is whether or not the fjord is wide enough for these tankers. The answer by all the experts is no. And our premier is saying, oh, she's not saying anything. Just fire away. Let's go. Let's bring this crook in from Indonesia, and I'm sure he'll do everything fine.
Well, there's one thing that Vancouver has against it,
Sorry?
and that I said the one thing Vancouver has against it is that it doesn't vote conservative. You'll notice all the closures of the Marine Rescue Base, Kitts Coast Guard, have all happened in ridings that didn't vote conservative.
Well, you know, that doesn't surprise me a bit.
Rafe, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
It was my pleasure always, Jim. Thank you, and talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.